Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I am your host, Stephen Peinecker, and folks, back by popular demand, my good friend, Jonathan Neville, is in the house. Welcome back to the program, sir.
Hi, Steve. So good to see you again.
Always a pleasure, sir. And one of the reasons I'm having him on is because we are going to talk about his latest book, The Rational Restoration, Reframes in the Pursuit of Clarity, Charity, and Understanding. And we're also going to talk a little bit about Richard Bushman, because Richard Bushman quotes Jonathan Neville quite extensively in his latest book. And I also want to remind folks here real quick that we do have, I just want to, now that it's on the top of my mind, I want to remind folks that I do have this screen share real quick. And I want to show that Digital Legend Press, which publishes many of Jonathan Neville's books, is doing, they still have the promo code going from Christmas. If you use the promo code MBR, you'll get a discount off of any book that is in their inventory. Of course, there I see they got one of Jonathan's books featured there, The Lost City of Zarahemla. I think I have the first edition. I don't think I have the second edition.
Oh, you got to get the second edition.
Okay, well, I'll have to do that, folks. So don't
Yeah.
forget to check out Digital Legends Press and their website, where you can find many of Jonathan Neville's books. And how many books have you published now, Jonathan?
For church books, I think it's about a dozen, something like
Okay.
that.
Okay.
I wrote a whole series of other books before I started doing church stuff, so
Okay. And
I've kind of lost track.
I got a bunch of them here. Boyd was always so generous to send me promo copies, and I've got a collection and I've read many of your books and really do respect you. Of course, the first time I had you on was actually before you published the book, but was one of the most intriguing hypotheses I've ever heard was Jonathan Edwards, the evangelical revivalist preacher, Jonathan Edwards' influence on the translation process of the Book of Mormon. And I knew I was onto something there when I met you on that
Mhm.
Zoom call at the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum, and I thought and of course I knew of you because in 2020 I watched Rod Meldrum's Come Follow Me
Oh,
series for the
right,
Book of
right.
Mormon. And you were frequently on there. And that was, now I knew your name, but the first time I actually saw you was on that series. I can't believe now it's been 4 years since
That's
they did that.
amazing.
And so now that was, of course, before I even started my channel. But that was a really important thing for me to watch, because it was the first time I was really engaging faithful Latter-day Saints. And I almost
Hmm.
like I was a fly in the wall, hearing them talk versus like, boy, they're so much like us evangelicals. They're so similar.
Yeah,
And that's when I
yeah.
really thought, oh, I just love Rob Meldrum. He's such a cool guy. I just get such a kick out of him. And last time I was in Utah, I went and saw the Book of Mormon movie, The Oath, with him. And so we got to see that together, which was cool to be able to share that experience with my audience as well. So I've had this long relationship with what you could argue are the Heartlanders and Jonathan Neville. But Jonathan Neville and Jonathan Edwards, that book that you wrote, was really, to me, I think, a real catalyst in really having some really good, productive conversations, because you had evangelical Christians buying your book who are Jonathan
Hmm.
Edwards fans. And then I was hearing from, you probably were too, hearing from Latter-day Saints who were downloading Jonathan Edwards' sermons
Yeah.
and studying them. Now
In
that to
fact,
me is like a really important convergence there. What do you say to that?
yeah, there's a couple of updates to that. One is in the process of doing that, I developed what we call the non-textual or non-biblical intertextual database, or NID that we described it. And I put a link on the Museum of the Book of Mormon website, mobom.org, where I had some preliminary database. But more recently, in fact, I pulled this up on my iPad. On Kindle, I uploaded, I don't know if you can see this very
Oh yeah,
well for
thank goodness.
reflection.
Uh-huh.
There's a
Yep.
lot of reflection, but it's the more complete database of the Jonathan Edwards terms and phrases, and it's on the Kindle, so you can see when I turn the page. Well, let me go this way. There's I guess this is the right way. There's a list of all the words and phrases in here. You can see them on here, and I could give you a link to this if you want,
Yeah.
but you can just click on any one of them and it'll go to that page where you have the Book of Mormon references and then all the Jonathan Edwards references for that particular word or phrase. And I was going to put it in print, but it's about 320,000 words. So it's way too big to print. But on the Kindle, you can just scroll through it and see all these references. And I have links to what Jonathan Edwards said and so on. So to me, in fact, just yesterday, I told a friend of mine I added about 5 new non-biblical Book of Mormon phrases. These aren't just an isolated word, these are phrases that link right to Jonathan Edwards. And just for the readers who are familiar with, or listeners who aren't familiar, I'll just briefly outline it. The idea is that, I still think that Joseph Smith translated the plates, right? And so for him to translate it, he had to have a vocabulary in his mind in order to articulate what he read on the plates. And I was puzzled because we all assumed that he was familiar with the King James Bible, but he was otherwise illiterate, right? At least a lot of people do. And so I started finding all these, as I was doing searches for non-biblical terms and phrases, kept coming up with Jonathan Edwards. And that didn't make sense to me until I discovered that right in Palmyra, in the bookstore he went to every week to get the newspaper for his father, there was a set of the 1808 collection of Jonathan Edwards' works, which was 8 volumes. And I was accessing the Yale database out of New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale University, and they have a gap in their database that I've since told them about, and they're working on it. But they didn't have everything that was in the 1808 edition, and so I actually bought on eBay. I bought an original set from 1808 of these 8 volumes that I went through, and I also got the Kindle version. Kindle version has some errors in digitization, so I often have to refer to the actual 1808 edition. But the link, at this point, I've concluded that almost everything that's not in the King James Bible in the Book of Mormon is in the works of Jonathan Edwards. And if it's not him, it's another one, James Hervey. We know Joseph Smith liked James Hervey because he donated a Hervey book to the museum or the library in Nauvoo in 1844. So anyway, so yeah, and so now what it led me to conclude is that the Book of Mormon is not trying to upend Christianity. It's the fulfillment of Christian aspirations, as Jonathan Edwards talked about. Because he talked about the restoration of the church in the latter days, said it would start in America, probably in this part of America. He lived on the western borders of Massachusetts, right on the border of New York there. And he was really prophetic in what he talked about, how the church, as he saw it, the Christian church, would develop and flourish and encompass the entire world. So there's so many parallels. You and I have talked about this before.
Sure. That's what I love about it. Well, and then of
Yeah.
course, maybe John Wycliffe was talking about young Joseph Smith when he was talking about having the Bible accessible to the farm boy, and stuff
Yeah,
like
there
that,
you go. But what I really love about it is I've been introducing Jonathan Edwards to the LDS
Yeah,
people
that's
who've
right.
never heard of him for the most part.
Right. And if anything, if he was ever referenced at all in Latter-day Saint materials, it was usually in a negative sense because, of course, he's best known for sinners in the hands of an angry God, and
Right.
was often contrasted as we are the antidote to, or we're the answer to that, or we push back on that sermon. And it's
Yeah.
just kind of interesting to see that it's much more complex and much more interesting going on. And I find your work to be absolutely fascinating. And what you do is you take a rational approach to how you approach the subject. And
Yeah.
what I love about you is, one of my favorite things that ever happened on this channel was when you came up with this idea of multiple working hypotheses.
Yeah.
And I just remember one of the first people to make a contribution to that idea of multiple working hypotheses was
Mhm.
Thomas Murphy, anthropologist, says, well, let me give my explanation of
Mhm.
what I think of the Book of Mormon being more of a 19th century based document. And he used it in the spirit of multiple working hypotheses. That's what I like about your approach, is that
Yeah.
you're willing to
Yeah.
take on all. And what you do beautifully in this book is that you actually talk about, you'll actually list out in chart form the different approaches to how you would deal with each issue. And I found
Mhm.
that to be really interesting. So maybe just explain what you're trying to accomplish with this book. And really honestly, I just tell people, said, listen, whatever gets people to think more rationally, I don't care what your perspective is, it's always better. And of course, you helped introduce the faith model on this
Mhm.
channel. Is one of the first places you talked about it, and he
Right.
kind of fleshed it out
Right.
in this book. So maybe just talk about the development of this book and what was the seed of it, and then ultimately what you hope to accomplish with it.
Okay. Well, as you say, the faith model, and that's the kind of an approach to understanding why people disagree about things. And it's an acronym that stands for facts, assumptions, inferences, theories, and hypothesis. And the idea is that everybody should be able to agree to the facts. And whether it's a critic of the Latter-day Saints, it's a supporter, former Mo, never Mo, whatever, or even never heard of religion. No, I mean, the facts are facts. And I give an example in there of a fact, which is that Lucy Mack Smith wrote in her history about what happened when Moroni first appeared to Joseph Smith, right? And told him it was on the hill of Cumorah. So we can all agree that that's a fact. We can see the original manuscript in the Joseph Smith papers. But immediately, everybody brings their own assumptions. And what I tried to do in this book was to illustrate the variety of assumptions that people make based on the same facts. And from that fact, we draw our assumptions, and then we fill in the gaps in the facts with our inferences sometimes that kind of correspond, that promotes our theory, kind of confirms our bias, so to speak. And I think by doing that, we can come to realize that what we disagree about is not the facts, it's about our subjective interpretations of the facts. And I think that's very healthy because, in my view, one of the biggest sources of contention is this idea of feeling a compulsion that everybody should agree with us, that we need to convert or convince or compel, in some cases, people to agree with us. And that comes from insecurity. If we feel like we need someone to agree with us in order to validate our own ideas. And that's really the source of contention. And so I figure this faith model will help clarify all the issues, and we can identify where we diverge, and we can have a reasonable, rational discussion about it. And that's what leads to multiple working hypotheses you mentioned about. So the whole idea of this book is to say, let's look at the facts. Let's look at how different people have interpreted them in the past. And then I propose something that I find to be more rational, but other people have different points of view, and that's fine.
One of the things that your opening chapter, you talk about how optimistic your worldview was about how wonderful the world is, how the people are living longer, there's less crime, there's less war, the air is cleaner, the water's cleaner, that there's a lot of positive things. And a lot of people, because we're so plugged into this 24-hour news cycle and headlines, they really think the world is getting worse. But actually, the science tells us that the world is actually getting better. And one of the people you actually like to quote from extensively in the book is Steven Pinker. Because that's kind of like the hypothesis. Well, actually, to me, the data pretty conclusively shows that actually things are getting better. And I just want to maybe talk about, because you seem to really like Steven Pinker, and maybe talk about the influence he's had on you and your thinking.
Well, he's written several books, and so I mentioned, I think I quoted from two of them in this particular one. But I don't agree with all of his conclusions, of course. But I love the way he approaches it. And that's why I quoted him a few times in here, because he points out that rationality is kind of the uniquely human attribute that distinguishes us from other animals and things. But it's also the basis that we can all communicate on if we are rational. And one of the things I didn't emphasize it much, but I put it in a footnote, that there's a difference between rationality and materialism as well. A lot of people think that the only rational approach to the world is materialism, and I disagree with that. That's another assumption, right, that people make. But I really think Steven Pinker has done a good job on explaining how our minds work, our psychology. And I have several other books of psychology that I noted in here, as well as others that I've been reading and have read. And psychology is kind of at the core of why we are unable to separate facts from assumptions. And it's because it's the confirmation bias idea that we are so compelled to justify our beliefs, and we rationalize our beliefs after the fact, all those kinds of psychological issues. And that's why I thought Steven Pinker had a lot to contribute there. I also talk about Matt Ridley in the book, which I know surprises some people because he's definitely a materialist. But I love the way Matt really approaches problems. And again, it's another example of where I agree with his data and his analysis. I just have different assumptions about what the significance of that data is.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great way to look at it. And I love the way that you're willing to, engage other thinkers and people and not just try to cut you. Unfortunately, what happens, especially in the apologetics world, is that it's like they put these blinders on and they have tunnel vision and they don't even acknowledge scholarship from other people because they don't even, it's like it doesn't even exist in their world. I like how you're able to take a lot of the tools from the secular world and be able to integrate it in how one can approach the restoration in the most rational way possible. Yesterday I spent 2 hours talking to a college freshman who goes to a university on the East Coast. He was raised Christian, but has been intrigued. He ran into a Book of Mormon in the 8th grade at presumably a Marriott hotel, and that caused him to go on his journey of Mormonism. Sound familiar? Yeah, same story. And there's a lot of people
Yeah.
out there like that. But he had mentioned about how, if we separate, as Christians on the outsiders are supposed to just not even look at anything that Mormons are contributing. He says, Steve, he says, I just find like the Mormon cosmology, its view of the material to be really fascinating and worthy to study, and gets challenged. So you have an evangelical Christian, well, he kind of more of a Protestant Christian background, engaging the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith and Mormon theology and cosmology. He currently would say he's an agnostic, but at least his mind is open enough to engage it. And I think that's what we all need to do. I think people from your
Right.
side need to embrace, look at Jonathan Edwards and look at other Christian thinkers, and people in the evangelical world and the Protestant world need to engage the challenge of the restoration,
Yeah.
because it's fascinating. And both of us two agreed, like we both are like, man, this is like so cool. Like
Yeah.
we
Right.
love studying Mormonism, and it really makes you think. And honestly, if you challenge your beliefs constantly, I'm always challenging my beliefs and I'm challenging other people's beliefs. But
Yeah.
actually that's a good thing because you're learning. And by
Hmm.
challenging it and always trying to disprove your hypothesis and try to take, is this a rational position to take? Unfortunately, I think a lot of people, and we see this with atheist progressives as well, or atheist materialists, they become fundamentalists. And we see Christian fundamentalists, and we see all these different types of people where everything's black and white, very Manchian. And it's like, you got to choose a side. And I'm like, no, I ain't choosing no sides. I like to have I want to have a conversation with the Apostle Paul. I want to have a conversation with Joseph
Yeah.
Smith. I want to have a
Right.
conversation with Sidney Rigdon and Jonathan Edwards. And to me,
Mhm.
that to me, it just makes you a better, wholer person. I mean, I as a person like you, and I think you and Richard Bushman both share something in common with each other. You both
Mhm.
are still students. You're
Yeah.
both still learning. Maybe just talk about the importance of having an open mind that's
Yeah.
grounded, but but to challenge yourself. I mean, and really how I mean, to me, it makes life so much more
Okay.
fuller.
Well, this when you look at the title of the book, it says reframes in the pursuit of clarity, charity, and understanding. We've already talked about the clarity part of it, which is the faith model. The charity part is assuming everybody's acting in good faith. You just have to assume that. But the understanding part is what you were just talking about, and that is seeking to understand one another. Like I'm really fascinated in why people think the things they do. You know, it's not that I don't feel threatened by other people's ideas at all. I'm curious about them, and Richard Bushman is. You are. There's some people are confident enough in their own let's say, life experience and spiritual feelings and understanding that they can engage with other people without feeling threatened. And that's a huge, I don't want to say advantage, but it kind of is an advantage because you can have rational conversations with people without feeling defensive. And Richard Bushman is certainly in that mode because he's open-minded, he's inquisitive, he likes learning new things. And what I found, in my involvement, I guess, in church history issues, I've been really surprised at how defensive some people have been. Because, coming from a legal background, I have no problem arguing a case in court with another lawyer and arguing as hard as we can, for our clients. but we can still be friends afterwards because we detach. There's an element of detachment between the issues and the personality. And I just assumed the same thing would happen when I got into this apologetics realm, but it's not like that, unfortunately. And I've had academics tell me it's not like that in any field of academics because people have their ideas, their pet theories, and they spend their careers promoting them, writing about them, teaching about them, and they identify with their ideas as a part of their personality. And so people I found on all sides of apologetics issues are very emotionally and personally involved with their own ideas. And so I hope detachment doesn't imply some kind of distancing or maybe apathy. That's not it at all. The idea is that we're just interested in how other people think and why they reach the conclusions that they do without feeling threatened to have these conversations. That's why you're so good at this, because I sense that you've always been pretty confident about where you are. You're always growing and you're amenable to change and new ideas, but you don't feel threatened by anybody's ideas, right?
Mm-mm.
And that's exactly the way I am too. So I'm happy to talk. And I gave some examples in there of my stepbrother, who was a Christian in the Campus Crusade for Christ. That was hassling me all the time about being Mormon, you know. So, but we were still friends. We're still friends today, you know. I didn't take that really personally, like an attack on me. It
Right.
was just of opinion. So
Well, and you just actually, you actually did a chapter in here about rough stone rolling.
yeah,
Maybe just talk about. I want you to talk about that chapter, and I also want to talk about um, your unique relationship and friendship with Richard Bushman as
okay,
well. And
sure,
maybe just because, of course, there was a lot of people that were didn't like rough stone rolling when it first came out,
yeah.
and especially more faithful members and stuff like that. Maybe just talk a little bit about once your engagement with rough stone rolling, your engagement with Richard Bushman, and then the importance of having this ongoing conversation with Richard, which I think is really fascinating. I wish, see, this is the sad part. The big name of Mormon scholarship takes Jonathan Neville very seriously. I tell people this. I've
Yeah.
told this publicly that when just recently, within the last year, I guess, but when the first conversation I ever had with Richard Bushman after I taped my interview with him the first time in June of 2021, I went and said, "What do you think of this Jonathan Neville guy?" Because I still wasn't quite sure what to make of yet.
Yeah.
What do you think of this Jonathan Neville guy? And he said, Jonathan Neville is a radical thinker in the best sense of the term. And then I knew I'm onto something here. And so
Okay.
that's been a really cool thing. So just talk about
Okay.
engaging his work and also
Sure.
engaging.
Okay, well, Stone Rolling, of course, I don't even remember when it first came out, but let's say 20 years ago. And it was very shocking for many members of the church because he talked about the stone in the hat translation, for one thing. And I'll just focus on that because that's the chapter that I addressed in this book. And so he made a bunch of statements in there that came across as factual when they were really more of a version of the facts, not a complete factual statement. And so that's what shocked people was that here Richard Bushman, a faithful member of the church, a patriarch, former stake president, and all that, was actively advocating or promoting the idea that Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon by reading the words off the stone he put in the hat instead of translating with Urim and Thummim. And so, in particular among Heartlanders, I know there's been a lot of pushback on Richard Bushman because of that. And I've known some members of the church who thought it was a fantastic analysis because it incorporated what David Whitmer and Emma Smith said and all that. Others who said, well, this is terrible. If this is the case, I've been lied to my whole life. I don't want anything more to do with the church, you know. So there's been a wide gamut of approaches. Well, when I first started going through that for myself a couple of years ago, I said, wait a minute, this book doesn't really tell all the details. It doesn't have all the facts in it. It's a version of history. And so I thought, well, I would do a kind of a peer review. And that's what I put in the book here. There's a chapter on just that one particular chapter of Rough Stone Rolling and how if I was to suggest to Richard to do a second edition or to revise it somehow, here's how I would suggest that he do it. And I pointed out some of the references that he omitted and some of the phrasing in there that he could have phrased a little differently to make it more, let's say, neutral on the issue. And I think by doing that, it's the kind of thing that Richard would appreciate because he likes to get feedback like any honest scholar does. Which, by the way, when you mentioned at the very beginning about the second edition of Lost City of Zarahemla, I meant to make a comment about that. And that's because it was my very first church book. I published it. I got a ton of pushback from the usual suspects at the Interpreter and so on. And as I read through their analysis, I thought, well, they had a few good points. And so I'm happy to adopt any good ideas or suggestions or facts I had overlooked. So I rewrote those sections that they objected to that were legitimate criticisms and did a second edition. So yeah, you've got the first edition. I need to get you a second edition. And they weren't huge substantive changes that affected the overall thesis, but they did. It was helpful for me to have some correction there.
Yeah.
And I embrace that anytime. In fact, I told someone recently, all my books are subject to change. And one of them was the Whatever Happened to the Golden Plates is another example, because originally in that book, I concluded that Joseph Smith used the Urim and Thummim in harmony and the stone in the hat in Fayette. And I put that right in the book. And then because of the input I was getting from people and criticism and discussions, I changed my mind about that. So in the most current editions, I revised that opinion. So I'm always open to suggestion, improvement, correction, and so on. But Richard, I think, is in that same vein. He's eager to have to fix errors, to consider new ideas. And so I wrote that little chapter in this book for people who, well, first of all, I should say it's unlikely Richard would ever do another edition of Rust on Rolling because it's been out for so long and he has other projects to work on. So I wrote this kind of as a companion piece for people who read Rust on Rolling, that they can read this. I have a similar version of it on the MoBomb site also for anybody that can access. So as far as my relationship with Richard, it's been interesting over the years. Because he lives in New York and I live in Oregon, and we don't really live in the same areas, but we've run into each other a few times. And one time I remember in particular, he was in I think it was at the Mormon History Association in St. Louis, and he had read my book about Whatever Happened to the Golden Plates. You know, the idea that there were two sets of plates, and we had a short conversation, and he said, "Boy, you're really sticking your neck out on that one." And so, because of course at the time, no one had ever thought of that before. It was kind of a revolutionary idea. This is 5 or 6 years ago. And by now it's kind of been more and more people have kind of accepted it, at least as a working hypothesis, and it actually answers so many questions in that time of church history that it really makes more sense than the traditional narrative, just from a rational standpoint, as well as a factual standpoint when you look at the sources. And so in his latest book that you held up about the gold plates, he mentioned that book in there as a possible reconciliation of the various discrepancies that we otherwise face when we're trying to explain how the plates are translated and what were the gold plates, how many of them were there, you know, who had them, what happened with them. So that's one of the things that I think attracted his interest in what the work I was doing. Well, and then later on, I don't remember how many years ago, I was in New York and we arranged to have lunch. I went over to his apartment at the university there. And I had my son with me, and my co-author Jim Lucas came too. And we had a delightful lunch together. We spent about 5 hours together just talking about all these issues. And he was particularly interested in the Jonathan Edwards material because his first two professional papers that were published were about Jonathan Edwards. And so he is very familiar with Jonathan Edwards. And he even told me, I hope this wasn't off the record, but he told me that he wished I'd have been around 15 years earlier when they started the Joseph Smith papers, because he said they had hired or engaged a consultant from the Yale University on the Jonathan Edwards papers. And at the time, they had considered doing kind of a joint project with the Jonathan Edwards papers, where they would kind of show Joseph Smith and Jonathan Edwards. They weren't contemporaries. They were, about 50, 60 years apart, but they had so much in common in the sense of how much of an influence they had on American religious history and so on. So they thought about having some kind of a joint project, but they could never find a connection between the two. So they just decided to have it be a completely separate project. And he said if I'd have been around 15 years earlier, maybe they would have found that connection.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been really great. He put me in touch with the people at the Jonathan Edwards papers at Yale. We've corresponded on that. And as I mentioned at the outset in my database, I just keep finding more and more connections. And it isn't, so I've had critics, of course, that, again, the usual suspects at the Interpreter that don't like this at all because,
Right.
it contradicts their whole stone in the hat thing.
Right.
But they, and Richard asked me this too. He says, well, Jonathan Edwards wrote so much material, wouldn't it naturally you'd find his words and phrases in the Book of Mormon? I said, well, I did a test on Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery, their writings, and they don't use Jonathan Edwards terminology or phraseology. And as I've explored it, there could be an element of confirmation bias, but it's uncanny because I'll constantly read these non-biblical phrases. It's not just words, it's phrases and even concepts, as I pointed out in the book on that. But these phrases, and I'll look on my word cruncher program, and they're nowhere in the scriptures except in the Book of Mormon, sometimes in the Doctrine and Covenants. And then I'll look at my Edwards database, and they pop right up, multiple examples. One of them in particular that I've talked about a lot is the natural man is an enemy to God, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's just one of hundreds of them.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's cool. So that I think that's what intrigued him. And then so he mentioned that he mentions the Jonathan Edwards in his book about the gold plates. And then the other one he talks about is my book on A Man That Can Translate, where I explain the Urim and Thummim and why that was important and so on. And my book that I wrote with Jim Lucas, which is called By Means of the Urim and Thummim, Restoring Translation of the Restoration. You've had us talk about that before on your show. But Richard did refer to that, but he finished the book before we had the title for our own book. So he just calls it an upcoming book by Jonathan Neville and James Lucas. But that's the one he was referring to, was By Means of the Urim and Thummim. And he thinks he was very impressed with that. We've had several dialogues with him, and he feels like we did uncover some things people hadn't noticed before and propose a theory of translation that makes sense, that shows why the plates and the Urim and Thummim were both essential to the process. And I think it's healthy to have people take another look at it. On the back of the book, he gave us a blurb that said everybody needs to deal with this book. And we've been sensing a little bit of a change in the zeitgeist about the translation.
Yes.
You may have seen that too.
Absolutely. Well, this is the thing, Jonathan. One of the unique things for me and my channel is the access I have to the scholars.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally, I can pick up the phone and contact people at the church office building, at BYU, at Mormon History Association. I'm plugged in and I'll be like, hey, I need information. Oh, call the so-and-so. And I'm able to get, I'll tell you what, when I started, when I got that reader's copy of that book and it had the Bushman quote in the back of it, I literally was taping with a group of about 4 or 5 scholars. I think it might have been the Joseph Smith papers, or no, it was a panel of scholars. And before we taped, I said, "Let me just read this." Okay, I showed them the book. Let me just read this blurb, and I read Richard Bushman's blurb, and then I read it, and then I say, Richard Lyman Bushman, and all their eyes got really big. They're like, whoa.
Yeah.
And these are big name scholars that were like, whoa, if Richard's taking Jonathan seriously, we're gonna have to really to take Jonathan seriously as well. And the fact that Richard quoted you extensively from your works, extensively in his work, really shows that over the course of the last 20 years, there's been an evolution in Richard Bushman's thought and how this, and not everything is etched in stone, that there's still a lot of things that we can't be so certain of, that the dominant narrative that currently exists does not necessarily mean that will be the dominant narrative 20 years from now. I think we're actually seeing it being chipped away at as we speak. And so that's the beauty of what you bring to the table, is you challenge that's what I do. I challenge the dominant narrative. I challenge the gatekeepers, because we don't want to fall into into this trap of just having blinders on and thinking one way and not being able to really look at all the evidence and maybe come up with another narrative, which I think that's really important that we do that, because then scholarship will become stagnant if it's not constantly trying to really reassess everything, look at new information, new evidence, and say, the history of Mormonism is going to look a lot differently 100 years from now than it does today.
Sure. Well, and along those lines, it gets back to this no more contention idea.
Right.
Because it's when people get ossified in their positions that they contend. But when there's a fluidity involved, an exchange, kind of an openness, a willingness to seek to understand before seeking to be understood, which is one of the 7 habits, those kind of things just open the whole environment for people to get along, even though they disagree. And that's really my ultimate goal. I know I've had a lot of critics who were upset by things that I've written, and some of the I've done some memes and things to kind of make fun. And it was never intended as attacking a person. It was intended to try to lighten up the mood a little bit, loosen them up a little bit.
Yeah, have some fun. Tongue-in-cheek stuff. And more importantly, Jonathan, you used your name. So they all knew who you were when you did
they
it.
knew who I was. Sure.
Yeah. Unlike
and I just thought it, because of this solid brick wall of academia, I felt we need to chip away at it a little bit and let these guys loosen up, realize that they're not as important, that them as a person is more important than their ideas. Try to detach them a little bit from that academic adherence to their ideas, so they're not so closely identified with their ideas that they can't change their mind. And so that was my whole purpose of doing that. And I realized I offended some of them, and so they retaliated. And my favorite was the Peter Pan guy, who I'd never even met. So he was vicariously offended on behalf of other people.
Right. Yeah.
I've mentioned that he took the idea of vicarious ordinances for the dead a little too far by being vicariously offended.
Right.
But,
I know.
but
Yeah.
hopefully, I think they've loosened up some. I've
I
had
hope so too.
some good dialogue with several of the CISAyers and M2Cers, as we call them, with our acronyms. But even the acronyms were tongue in cheek, right?
Right. That's the
Obviously.
point. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, have a sense of humor, please.
Yeah.
We could all use
Yeah.
that right now in this world we live in. And that's what encourages me. Actually, I predict that one day you will address a Fair Mormon conference. I predict that one day you will be published in the Interpreter, because I think you will do nothing but benefit, and you'll benefit and they'll benefit. Because again, if we're having this conversation and we want to do good Mormon scholarship, then we got a lot diversity of ideas and opinions come in. I think that's really important. And again, I don't hate anybody over at Fair Mormon. I don't hate anybody at the Interpreter.
Me neither.
Do I have disagreements? Do I feel sometimes they didn't treat me that well? Maybe. Did I find some alarming things about what they were doing? I was able to talk about the Bill Reels program, certainly. But again, I was really, again, it's still just, I mean, I call balls and strikes. And if I see somebody doing something that's unethical or not right, I'm going to point it out.
Well, and I've even had people from that camp be upset that I showed up on the Backyard Professors podcast a couple of times,
Right.
And I'd be happy to go on Dylan or anybody. Dylan apparently doesn't want me to come on, but RFM, any of those guys, I'd be happy to engage with, because to me, I don't feel threatened by what they're saying at all.
Right.
And I feel like an interchange is healthy for everybody,
Absolutely. I think that's what's so important, is to go on all the different, I mean, look, I don't think that it just does no good if you're just in your little silo. You actually only people within your silo are paying any attention to what you're doing. You're not affecting the broader scholarly community at all. You're just all writing papers for each other, that you're reading each other's papers and really not having an impact on anything. And nobody's talking about these people at Mormon History Association conferences. They're just not. And then or at John Whitmer. And, of course, I gave a presentation at John Whitmer earlier last year. And so I'm very plugged in with the scholarly community. And it's kind of like the whole thing with like these Christian apologists that have been attacking me.
Yeah.
Quite a bit more and more recently. Of course, as I've gotten bigger, of course, that's going to happen. But I literally, my biggest criticism of Mormon apologists, I mean, Christian apologists, is just do better scholarship. That's all I ask. Just do better scholarship. Don't be, I mean, some of the stuff that these so-called researchers put out is laughable and garbage. And
Yeah.
it's like, you're not doing us any favors by giving us bad scholarship. I'm saying Christian apologists who are engaging Mormonism, okay, and you need to come out to Mormon History Association, give papers. You need to contribute to the scholarly dialogue. If you're going to have research in your name, present your research to peer-reviewed journals. And
Yeah.
let's have real good scholarship. I want Christian evangelical scholars who are engaging Mormonism to actually do really good scholarship to actually benefit everybody. That's why I laud the work of Dr. Kyle Bashirs, who is just doing fantastic work. And actually later this year, we'll have a book by a major Christian publisher about Mormonism that's going to change a lot of for people's perspectives on how
Cool.
to
Yeah.
approach the Mormonism. That's what I love. We need to change too as evangelicals. We fall into these ruts as well. So when I critique, don't take it personally. Two,
Yeah.
don't personally attack me because that's what they do. Three, you know how to contact me. I've been messaging you, yet you decide to attack me publicly on my Facebook pages. Why don't you just message me? And why don't
Yeah.
you just take the Zoom calls? Why don't you have, I've gone to so many of these people and said, well, let's just hop on Zoom and hash this out. Crickets. They're
Well,
cowards.
Steve, this is exactly those three principles: clarity, charity, and understanding.
Exactly.
The clarity part they don't like because they don't want to be clear about their facts, assumptions, etc. The charity part is evident by the fact they won't contact you and have a dialogue with you.
Right.
And the understanding part is maybe the most frustrating because they don't seek to understand.
Right.
They seek to character or provide caricatures
Right.
and tell us what we believe,
Yeah. Oh yeah. They go to me
Yeah.
and they say, oh, you're a progressive. I'm like,
Yeah, exactly. There you go.
Like,
Yeah.
like this person, obviously you haven't done your research. You haven't actually watched any of my stuff because I criticize everybody equal. I mean, I'm a non, I don't care where you're coming. I'll critique if I see something that's something to be
Yeah.
critical of.
Yeah.
I probably lean a little bit more being critical of progressives than I do conservatives, although it's probably close 51-49, but still, but to say that I'm a progressive is nonsense. And look, and that's fine. Be a progressive. I'm not against progressives. I just would not
Yeah.
categorize myself as a progressive. Okay. And I think, but they can't, they refuse to even say you're not really a Christian or you're not really an evangelical. And it's like, man, and then I have this Presbyterian minister. And by the way, folks, for those of you, these critics of mine out there, I have actually responded to everything that you've criticized me for, but I've never heard
Yeah.
anything back. Why haven't I heard
Yeah.
back? Because I went on a post-Mormon feminist program to talk about it. And that's where my answers are. And I was waiting for you guys to see how good your research is. If you find that video, then you'll know the response. But apparently you haven't found the video, so you haven't heard my response. But I will say this, what's so interesting to me is I have this Presbyterian pastor in Utah, and they're all upset because I went to a Bickertonite baptism last month, okay? And like, well, how could you do that? And you're celebrating. I was like, oh my gosh. So then this Presbyterian minister goes, is Joseph Smith a true prophet of God, or is he a con artist? I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
not going for falling for that, dude. I'm not going to take the bait. I'm not going to answer an either or question like that because it's much more than, look, hey, pastor, you got 3 hours that we can hop on Zoom?
Yeah. Right.
We'll have the conversation that way. But I'm not going to say yes or no. That's stupid. It's not the
Yeah.
right way of trying to learn. You're literally just, okay, manching in black and white. That's it. You're on this side or in that side. You're in this box. You're in that box. I see the same thing happening to me that's been happening to you. And so we're trying just to push back against that mentality because it doesn't do us anybody any good.
Well, and in the interest of charity, we have to recognize that for a lot of these people, it's their livelihood. It's
Right.
just like in the academic world, they can't risk having their constituents or their followers have open minds because then they may lose them as contributors, financial contributors. And so much of this dialogue within LDS realms, within restoration realms, within Christian realms, and even worldwide is financially driven, really, ultimately. And it's reputation, it's the psychology of adhering to your own ideas, and it's economic. And so that's why I feel like we can be charitable towards those people who are so rigid in their views. And all we can try to do is say, hey, we understand where you're coming from. Here's another way to look at the same facts, and let's just have an exchange. And I'm not trying to convert you. I'm not trying to change your mind. I just want you to understand where I'm coming from because I want to understand where you're coming from. And then see, my idea, and I don't know if we've talked about this before. I once wrote a book called Zion Without Us. Have I talked about this with you before? I don't think I have.
Don't think, yeah, talk about it.
Well, the idea is that the Lord is not only working with Latter-day Saints to establish Zion on earth. There's people of all faiths, of all and no faith, all denominations, who are trying to make the society better, which is the definition of a Zion society, right? And so if we focused on that, if we focus on establishing Zion, then our differences of opinion and different approaches or interpretations and all that, assumptions and inferences, would diminish in relevance and importance, and we could focus on working together to make the world a better place, to usher in the second coming and the millennium. That's what we should be focused on. And that's one of the things I loved about Jonathan Edwards, coming back to him, is he was focused on that. And he talked about ways that regardless of your beliefs, how we can work together to really invite Christ to return again. And I'm hoping that that's a message that breaks through all this contention, this ridiculous contention, both among Latter-day Saints and between Latter-day Saints and Christians and between Christians and Muslims and everybody else. Of course, Muslims maybe aren't looking for the second coming, but you know, the point is that we all should be seeking to establish Zion.
Well,
And
actually,
that's something.
Muslims do believe that Jesus will return. That is that.
Okay, but not in the same way Christians do, I don't
Right,
think.
right, but right.
Okay. But you know, everybody wants. I think it's a core human desire to have a more perfect society.
Mhm.
And the politicians and business interests and ideological interests all block that for economic reasons and power reasons. But we, the people, once we recognize what they're doing, we can unite to make that happen. And we just have to adopt these three principles of clarity, charity, and understanding. I think we can do it. We can eliminate contention among us, and we can all work together to make this happen. That's my ultimate objective in doing all of this. And I think in this Rational Restoration book, I talk about that a little bit, about establishing Zion and how that can happen. And I feel like at some point, if you and I are successful, Steve, then we can get everybody united and focused on that goal instead of arguing about what passage in the Bible means this, you know.
Right,
Um,
exactly. I love
that's
that.
all.
I love that. And it's so funny because people, I'm very open about my friendship with John Dehlin. Okay,
Mhm. Yeah.
and John is a friend,
Mhm.
and John is a seeker, and John wants to make the world a better place too. I think we need to be so open-minded and so broad in our thinking that we should look at people that we would on paper say are enemies and realize that they can be fellow co-belligerents in trying
Mhm.
to um, help make this world a better place. And I do think that if we as image bearers, okay, who
Mhm.
are created in his image, all right, I don't think we are just a bunch of automatons that were wound up and we just go through life and we
Right.
just go through the motions. I think that one could argue that Jesus is waiting to return, but he's waiting for us to get our act together.
That's
And
why I call it, we need to be inviting Christ to return again.
exactly, yeah,
And,
that he could
and
have come at any period of time in human history, but he's
yeah,
waiting. And he's waiting
yeah.
for us to maybe figure things out. It's kind of a Mormon concept. Kind of like that though. I like it. But I mean, just approaching it differently. But I'm like I said, I challenge people from all different perspectives. And then just to say, John Dehlin is a friend. Radio Free Mormon is a friend. And
Mhm.
recently on a podcast, Radio Free Mormon was referred to as being evil. Well, I will tell you that I was having a mental health, not really a major mental health breakdown, but just kind of going through, I was a melancholy, depressed thing. One of the
Mhm.
first people to call, I posted on Facebook, hey, I could use your prayers. One of the first people to call me was RFM. All right.
Yeah.
That's not an evil man. That's a friend. So I do think that I just want to let everybody know, I push back on everybody. Okay. I criticize Mormon apologists. I criticize Christian apologists. I criticize faithful Mormons and I criticize ex-Mormons. I do it all the time. And when I say critical, I mean it in a way I'm challenging you
Yeah.
to put aside your prejudices, put aside the name calling, and look at people as we're actually all on the same team.
Yeah.
We're all part of the human race, folks. And even if
Well,
you
plus just
John Glenn,
by virtue of our interest in these topics shows that we're on the same team. We
yes,
have interpretations and so on. That's why I think I like your word challenge a lot better than criticize.
Yeah, challenge.
Yeah, yeah, challenge and challenge in the sense of aspiring to this, what I keep referring to, this clarity, charity, and understanding. I think if we all incorporated those three principles, we would we would be shocked at how much alike we are and
Absolutely.
how many areas we could work together in.
That's so true. And once you, David Boyce, I've told this story before, but so one of the key advantages that people like David Boyce and Jeff McCullough and myself and others who are evangelicals or Protestants that are engaging in the restoration in a much different, more positive, productive way is that unlike all the evangelical, anti-Mormon evangelicals that are out there, who are just out there during the temple, outside the temple or outside a general conference, holding signs and
Yeah,
protesting. Nobody's paying attention to you. Nobody's reading. Nobody cares what you think here. They think you're a joke.
yeah,
But but those people will never get to see the pearls of the restoration. And once you see the pearls, you can't unsee them. And it's a gift and a privilege that has been afforded us of a very rare, a rare air here of evangelicals who
mhm,
actually get to see the see the pearls, and that's the
yeah,
beautiful thing, and then just to say like okay, so last month I'm in Utah. I have this meetup. I usually get between 20 and 30 people to my meetups, and you'll have ex-Mormons sitting next to TBMs, sitting next to evangelicals, sitting next to scholars, sitting next to atheists, sitting next to LGBTQ people, sitting next to return missionaries, sitting next to polygamists, you name
yeah,
it. And we're all at the same table and we're breaking bread together.
yeah,
It can be done. And
sure.
that's what I'm trying to do is model. And again, yeah, I think I'm going to quit using criticize. And when I say criticize, I mean it like in scholarly
I know
critical.
you have a different
But
connotation, but it's still
I
the
think
word.
challenge is really the key
Yeah,
thing. I want to challenge you. I want to make you feel uncomfortable. Jonathan does that to a lot of people too. I think that's why we're
yeah,
brothers from another mother, I
yeah.
think.
And even maybe a better word is invite.
Yeah.
The church's approach now is love, share, and invite. We don't even talk about convert. And I think that's a key principle that we can apply in all these dialogues is to love, share, and invite. We're just inviting people to be more open-minded. We're inviting people to try to understand where we're coming from. We're inviting people to share the same objectives. And we're inviting people to establish Zion together, regardless of your religious beliefs.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Awesome.
I'll tell
So
you.
I would say, Steve, from now on, you should do that. You should say, I invite evangelicals. I invite ex-Mos.
Well, of
And
course,
not criticize.
you're all invited to come to my meetups whenever I'm in
There you
Utah.
go.
And this is
Okay.
the other thing, Jonathan. It's so funny. I literally have people say, "Yeah, I saw you at Sunstone, or I saw you here, and I saw you there." And I'm like, "And you didn't come and say hi?" We're like, "Oh, well, we didn't want to bother you. Come and say hi. Trust me, I love it
Okay.
when you come and say hi and tell me your stories." Last year I was at Sunstone, and some people went to me and they're like, "What is the most important thing that you think you've accomplished with your channel?" And I went to them and I said, "Standing right here, right now, having this conversation with you in this hallway.
Perfect.
That's the most important."
Perfect.
And really
That's
what
awesome.
happens off camera is much more substantial than what happens on camera. I mean, I'm living this, folks. I'm literally living this on a daily basis, working on getting people to get to each other who never would talk to each other, break bread with each other, and have these conversations. I do believe that if somehow, some way, humanity is going to play a role in bringing forth Zion, it's going to look a lot like what we're trying to do here.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. I love what you're doing.
Thank you.
So I'm glad we had this chance to talk today.
Always awesome, dude. I think you're an awesome human being. I love the work that you do. I know you're going to be heading out of the country for a couple weeks, so we wanted to get this interview
Yeah.
in. Again, the book is of course, Lost City of Zarahemla, but we got to get you the second edition. The book is The Rational Restoration, and
That's the
just a
one.
quick
Okay.
reminder, folks. Let's just go and do the screen share real quick. That you can go to the Digital Legend website. And oh, look, the Neville collection pops up. And there you are with,
Oh,
oh, there
okay.
you are
There
with
you go.
my boys from Stick of Joseph are there. Isn't
Oh,
that
the
cool?
Paul brothers. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Okay.
Paul
Cool.
brothers. So yeah, so all of Jonathan's books are available. Check out Digital Legend. They do more than just Mormonism. They actually do a lot of Amish and Mennonite stuff, and this is a really cool and unique publisher. Boyd Tuttle is a good dude. He's good friends with Lynn Ridenhour, and you're friends with him, the Southern Baptist minister who preaches from the Book of Mormon. We love him as well, and we love you, Jonathan. Before I let you go, is any final words you want to share with the audience?
Well, I just love the way we ended this, talking about love, share, and invite, and building Zion. I mean, those are the essence of what I'm all about, and I know you are too. So that was a great way to end this.
And that's the challenge, folks. That's the challenge. Let's do it. I love it.
And it's
Okay,
not the
folks.
criticism.
That's right. Okay. So I love all of you. I really appreciate. In the link in the description, there are places where you can financially support the channel. And I want to say thank you to everybody who is financially supporting the channel. I couldn't do it without you. It really does play a major role. I do need to raise some money. I need to do some equipment upgrades. Maybe I'll have some kind of capital campaign or something at some point. I'd like to maybe become a not for profit down the road so that people can, their contributions can be tax deductible as well. Maybe that's something we'll try to accomplish this year as well. There will be links in the description to everything we talked about, including the Digital Legend website where you can purchase Jonathan's fine books, and as well as many others. And remember, this is the most important thing, is all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.